He never barked, never begged, never broke anything. Bruno was just a quiet dog who liked to lie by the fire, but one rainy morning he vanished into the forest and came back with something that would leave everyone speechless. What began as a normal day turned into a revelation. A dog who never asked for anything brought home the most fragile lives anyone could imagine. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move, you please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Willow Creek was the kind of town where time moved slower than elsewhere. An old logging town nestled at the edge of the Oregon wilderness, kissed by morning fog and the scent of damp pine. On this early October morning, the sky wore a coat of pewter clouds, and a cold drizzle fell in whispers just enough to soak the moss-covered roofs and turn the forest paths to velvet mud. The Reynolds house stood on the outskirts of town, a single-story wooden home with faded blue paint and a crooked porch swing that creaked in the breeze. Behind it, a trail wound into the dense woods, ending at an old, unused cabin that had belonged to Margaret's late husband. Margaret Reynolds, 68, was a woman of quiet resilience. Tall and wiry, with silver hair pulled into a bun and deep-set eyes that missed nothing, she carried herself like someone who had lived 100 lives, and in many ways she had. Once a nurse, later a full-time caretaker at an elder care facility, Margaret had spent her years mending others, only to return to an empty house each evening after her husband's sudden passing. Retirement hadn't softened her, but made her more attentive, more reflective. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried the weight of earned wisdom. Her grandson, Noah, had come to live with her after the divorce of his parents. She never asked for the burden, but she took him in without a moment's hesitation. Noah, aged 10, was a boy who preferred silence over speech. Pale and slight, with messy brown curls always tucked behind his ears, he often walked with his shoulders slightly hunched as if trying to become smaller. His eyes, green observant, seemed older than his years. Noah rarely made eye contact and hardly ever spoke in full sentences unless it was to Bruno. Drawing was his escape, the only way he could tell the world what he felt without having to explain it out loud. His sketchbooks filled with forests, animals, and imaginary places were his most treasured possessions. He didn't talk much to Margaret either, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. He needed space, and she gave it freely. Bruno was the glue holding their quiet household together. A 7-year-old golden retriever with fur like toasted caramel and eyes the color of old amber, he had been a therapy dog in a senior care center for most of his life. Margaret had met him there during her final years working as a nurse, and the bond had been instant. When she left the job, she couldn't bear to leave Bruno behind. The retirement home, understanding the connection, allowed her to adopt him. Bruno moved with the calm grace of a dog who had seen many things and judged none. He would nuzzle Margaret's knee on cold mornings and sit silently by Noah during long drawing sessions, resting his head on the boy's feet, as if to say, "You don't need words." On this particular morning, the drizzle turned heavier as Bruno padded softly through the wet undergrowth, nose twitching with every scent. He had taken this path many times, leading past the blackberry bramble over the mossy footbridge and down to the forgotten cabin. Margaret had once warned Noah not to venture too deep, but she allowed Bruno his freedom. The woods seemed to give him purpose. As Bruno approached the cabin, something sharp and different tugged at his instincts. A sound not loud but insistent. He slowed. There, beneath a half-collapsed wooden plank and a soggy tarp, a faint mewling. A nest, a clutch of kittens no more than a week old. Their fur clung to their tiny bodies, soaked and shivering, their eyes still closed. No mother in sight. The rain continued to fall, seeping through the holes in the tarp, pooling in the dirt. Bruno stood still for a moment, ears twitching, then stepped forward. There were 3 of them, One all black, another gray-striped, and the last a pale orange with a pink nose. Bruno sniffed each in turn, then gently picked up the black kitten with his mouth. With the same gentle precision he'd once used to hand stuffed bears to elderly patients, he turned back toward the house. Back at the Reynolds home, Margaret stood at the kitchen sink washing old mugs when she heard the back door creak open. She turned expecting to see Noah, but it was Bruno, dripping wet with something small and limp in his mouth. She gasped, dropping the mug. What on earth? Noah, who had been drawing on the floor by the fireplace, looked up. Bruno gently placed the kitten onto the blanket near the hearth, then turned and trotted back out tail high, purpose renewed. Margaret bent down, gathering the trembling kitten in a dish towel. It let out a weak mew. "Lord, have mercy," she whispered, brushing a finger along its head. "Where did you find this?" 10 minutes later, Bruno returned with the second, then the third. By the time the last kitten was nestled beside the fire, dry and wrapped in rags, Margaret had already made up a cardboard box lined with one of her old wool sweaters. Noah sat nearby, sketching his pencil, moving faster than usual. His drawing showed Bruno in the forest, a tiny kitten hanging from his mouth like a precious cargo. He didn't show it to anyone right away, but for the first time in a long while, Noah smiled. Margaret Reynolds had seen plenty in her 68 years, births, deaths, wars, healings, but nothing quite like the sight before her fireplace that afternoon. There was Bruno, her golden-furred, ever-gentle companion, curled protectively around 3 tiny kittens. They were nestled into the crook of his belly as if it were the most natural bed in the world, and Bruno watched them with soft amber eyes filled with a stillness Margaret could only describe as reverence. Every so often, he would lower his head and gently lick one of them, pausing to listen for their faint mews or the rhythmic sound of their tiny breaths. She had expected a dog of his size to treat the kittens with at least curiosity, maybe even confusion. But what she saw was more than acceptance, it was instinct. She stood frozen for a moment, dish towel still in hand before her practical nature took over. Without speaking, she shuffled toward the storage closet, pulled out a spare cardboard box, and began lining it with one of her thick woolen sweaters, the green one she hadn't worn in years, but kept around for sentiment. Noah sat on the floor beside Bruno, knees drawn to his chest, quietly observing. He didn't speak, but his hands were already sketching, his fingers darkened with graphite. His sketchbook was balanced on his lap, and each stroke seemed to give shape to the moment, as if he were trying to preserve it before it dissolved into memory. The kittens, barely a week old, had begun to twitch in their sleep, tiny paws flexing. Their fur, black, striped gray and faded ginger, was still damp, though Bruno's warmth had done more than any towel ever could. Margaret knelt beside them, brushing a strand of gray hair from her eyes, then gently reached to check each kitten. All 3 were alive, but underfed and cold. They would need milk, and not from a mother who had vanished into the storm. That evening, after a trip to the small town's only convenience store, Margaret returned with formula and the smallest baby bottles she could find. She tried her hand at feeding them, but it was Noah who stepped forward with an unexpected gentleness. He took the bottle from her hand and sat cross-legged on the floor beside Bruno. One by one, he cradled each kitten in his palm, patiently coaxing them to drink. Bruno remained still the entire time, his large body forming a barrier against the world. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, casting soft golden light through the kitchen window. Margaret stood sipping coffee, lost in thought, when the doorbell rang. Visitors were rare out this far. When she opened the door, she was met by a girl of about 11, with frizzy red hair tied in 2 messy buns and oversized glasses slipping down her nose. "Hi," the girl said with an easy confidence, hugging a bundle of mismatched fabric. "I'm Emma. I live 2 houses down. My mom saw the pictures of your dog on Facebook. She said I could come see the kittens if it's okay." Emma Callahan was the type of child who knew how to fill a silence without overwhelming it. She had a round face sprinkled with freckles and wore a purple hoodie 2 sizes too big. Her boots were covered in mud. Without waiting for a formal invitation, she stepped inside and held out her bundle, several old baby blankets. To keep them warm, she explained, her voice softening as she caught sight of the makeshift bed near the fireplace. Margaret hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in, but be quiet. They're still very small." Noah peeked from the hallway, his sketchbook clutched protectively. Emma waved, not expecting a response. She simply walked over to Bruno, and the kittens knelt down and gently added her blankets around the edge of the box. Bruno sniffed her fingers, once gave her a nod with his eyes, then went back to watching his feline charges. From that morning on, Emma became a fixture. She came by nearly every afternoon, sometimes bringing bits of kibble or warm towels from her home. Unlike other kids her age, she didn't ask too many questions. Instead, she would sit beside Noah, talking softly to the kittens or humming while watching them nap. Slowly, Noah began to respond not in words, but in actions. He started handing her colored pencils when she pointed at a sketch. One day, he even drew a cat with her wild hair and glasses. Meanwhile, news of Bruno's unusual behavior spread beyond Willow Creek. A local teenager, Zachary Benton, had snapped a picture of the dog and kittens through the Reynolds front window and posted it online. The photo quickly went viral in the town's Facebook group. "Golden Retriever Adopts Kittens" was the headline. Some reacted with admiration, calling Bruno a saint, a hero, a gentle giant. Others were skeptical, murmuring about what kind of dog would allow cats that close. One particularly outspoken voice belonged to Cheryl Mathis, a retired librarian with stiff posture and a reputation for gossip. "It's unnatural," she told anyone who'd listen at the post office. "You mark my words, those kittens will mess up that dog's instincts." Margaret ignored it. She had lived long enough to know that people were frightened by what they didn't understand. Still, she found herself triple-checking the locks at night, uncomfortable with how exposed her house felt after the photo went viral. But none of that reached the sanctuary of the living room, where Bruno continued his quiet vigil, and Noah and Emma fed the kittens in shifts. By the end of the week, the kittens had begun to open their eyes. They stumbled across the blanket like tipsy explorers, following the slow wag of Bruno's tail. Bruno would occasionally nudge them back into place, or curl his body around them when they strayed too far. It was an odd family canine feline and 2 wide-eyed children, but it was whole in a way that defied explanation. And for the first time since moving in with his grandmother, Noah felt less like a guest and more like a part of something. The wind had picked up in Willow Creek. Autumn storms were no stranger to the Oregon town, but this particular one carried more than just rain. In its gusts, it brought voices, whispers, opinions, and in a place as tightly stitched as Willow Creek opinions spread like wildfire. The image of Bruno, the golden guardian of kittens, had made its way beyond Facebook posts and local curiosity. It had been shared on a regional pet lovers page reposted by an animal rescue group, and had even appeared on a morning segment of a Portland news outlet. What had once been a quiet moment by a fireplace had turned into a spectacle. At the center of it all was Margaret Reynolds, standing in her creaking house, holding the storm door shut against both the literal and figurative wind. The knock came at noon on a Saturday, sharp and assertive. Margaret opened it to find Linda Pearson, 52, a wiry woman with sharp cheekbones and a constantly pursed mouth. She wore a thick wool cardigan, buttoned all the way up, despite the mild weather, and her hands clutched a weathered photo like a subpoena. "You need to explain this," Linda said, holding the picture up. It showed a long-haired calico cat with emerald eyes lounging on a broken porch swing. Her name was Daisy. She disappeared 2 weeks ago. She had just had kittens. Margaret blinked. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I don't understand." Don't play dumb. I know that dog of yours found those kittens. What I'm saying is maybe he found them somewhere he wasn't supposed to." Behind Margaret, Bruno sat by the hearth, eyes alert. The kittens were curled in a ball beside him, their coats fluffed and eyes now wide open. Linda peered past the screen door. He's been out wandering these woods for years. Who's to say he didn't nose into someone else's property and take those babies? Margaret's voice remained calm, but there was iron underneath it. Bruno didn't take them. He saved them. If you have a concern, bring it to the proper channels. I plan to, Linda sniffed. Animal control ought to hear about this. With that, she turned on her heel and marched back to her rusted Subaru tires crunching over wet gravel. Inside, the warmth of the fire no longer reached Margaret's bones. She sat down in her armchair and stared at the flickering logs, one hand resting on Bruno's head. He nudged her palm softly, as if apologizing for something he didn't understand. The tension seeped into the household. Margaret, always stoic, grew quieter. Noah, noticing the shift, retreated into drawing even more pages, and pages of forests, hollow trees, nests hidden in shadows. Emma, ever the observer, noticed something wasn't right. One cloudy afternoon, while Bruno slept near the window and the kittens chased dust motes, Emma whispered to Noah across the table, "What if we figured out where the kittens really came from?" Noah looked up from his sketchbook. His pencil paused mid-line. "I mean, like an investigation." Emma continued, eyes brightening. "We follow Bruno next time he sneaks out. Watch where he goes. It'll be like the Stray Kitten Files." Noah gave the faintest nod. He wrote on the margin of his drawing, "Stray Kitten Journal, Day 1. So began their secret project. Every morning before school and every afternoon after homework, they kept watch. Emma brought binoculars, plastic ones with blue rubber grips, and Noah brought his sketchbook. They took notes. Bruno went east, stopped at Oak Tree, sniffed around Blackberry Patch, sat for 11 minutes. They followed him once, keeping to the trees, stepping carefully on moss and soft dirt. Bruno was methodical, moving slow-nosed, low, as though tracing invisible footprints. On the third day, he veered off the usual trail and crossed a narrow stream behind the old lumber mill ruins. Emma nearly slipped trying to follow, and Noah had to grab her sleeve. Where he stopped made their breath catch. At the base of a fallen log partly hidden under moss was the collapsed entrance of an animal den, small, just large enough for a cat. Inside were remnants of fur feathers and a broken milk dish. Noah quietly sketched it, while Emma pulled out her phone to take pictures. "It's abandoned now," she whispered. But it was a nest. Noah wrote Day 3, possible origin nest found, no cat, no threat, no mother. Then he paused and added, "Bruno knew." When they returned, Margaret was in the kitchen, phone in hand. Her brow was furrowed and a half-finished cup of tea sat cooling beside her. Animal control left a message, she said, voice flat. "They're sending someone for a wellness check." Monday. Emma's face fell. Noah's fingers tightened around his pencil. "We'll prove they're safe," Emma said. "We'll show them." That night, Bruno didn't sleep. He sat by the front door, ears up, body stiff. Around midnight, Margaret opened the door and let him out into the moonlit yard. He hesitated, then disappeared into the woods. Noah, already awake, watched from the window. The next morning, Bruno returned, but without his usual calm. His fur was damp, his paws muddy, and his eyes troubled. He paced tail low and nudged Margaret's hand repeatedly. She bent down, puzzled. "What is it, old boy?" Then she saw it, a thin scratch on his nose, not deep but fresh. Something had happened out there. Noah, watching it all, opened a new page and drew Bruno standing in front of a dark forest, shielding tiny kittens behind him. Sunday morning arrived with a silence that felt unnatural for Willow Creek. The rain had stopped, but a stillness lingered in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Mist clung low to the earth, weaving around pine trunks and curling along the fences like forgotten ghosts. At the Reynolds home, the windows were fogged from the warmth inside, where Bruno lay at the door, restless. Margaret was sipping her tea at the kitchen table, eyes trained on the back door, knowing. Bruno hadn't touched his breakfast. He paced in small loops, then stood facing the door, ears slightly back-tail low, not out of fear, but insistence. It wasn't a request, it was a mission. Margaret exhaled. "All right then," she murmured. "Go." As Bruno slipped through the door and into the thick gray, outside 2 smaller figures emerged from behind the living room curtain. Noah and Emma, already dressed in boots and jackets, nodded to each other. Noah clutched a sketch pad, its front marked field notes, and Emma had stuffed snacks and a flashlight into her coat pockets. They waited 2 minutes, then followed quietly through the trees, letting Bruno's golden coat guide them through the fog. He walked with purpose, not running, not wandering, but moving, as if drawn by some inner compass. He crossed the narrow creek again over a fallen log, then veered left toward a part of the woods neither child had explored before. And then they saw it. A half-collapsed barn stood behind a tangle of blackberry bushes, its roof broken in places where ivy pushed up like fingers through cracks. The red paint had long since faded to a dull rose. Boards creaked in the wind, and a rusted weather vane squeaked overhead. Bruno slowed as he neared the side of the barn and paused by a gap in the wood, just wide enough for his frame. Emma gasped softly, tugging Noah's sleeve. "Look." Inside, crouched in a shallow nest of rags and old straw, was a cat, thin to the point of skeletal. Her gray and white fur was patchy, and her sides heaved as she struggled to lift her head. Her green eyes blinked, slowly fixed on Bruno without fear. A final kitten, tiny orange and shivering, pressed into her belly, but it was clear the mother had nothing left to give. Bruno didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, sniffed the kitten gently, then very slowly took it in his mouth. The mother cat didn't move. She watched him as if passing a silent trust. Emma covered her mouth. "She's letting him take it." Noah wrote in his sketchbook, "Barn behind red fence. Female cat, emaciated, eyes aware, trusts Bruno, final rescue." The walk back was slower. Bruno cradled the kitten like a sacred thing, and Noah and Emma stayed close behind, neither speaking, both overwhelmed by the weight of what they'd just witnessed. Back at the house, Margaret stood waiting at the back door holding a towel. She'd known. She always knew. Later that afternoon, Emma, carrying a shoebox lined with cloth, knocked on the door across the road, a house shaded by an enormous oak, and a fence overgrown with honeysuckle. Linda Pearson answered, wearing her usual gray cardigan, her sharp demeanor slightly dulled by the sight of Emma's flushed, serious face. "We found her," Emma said simply. "The cat. Your Daisy. She's not gone, but she's not well." Linda blinked. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the box and opened it. Inside was the orange kitten, eyes half closed, swaddled in warmth. "Where?" "She was in the old barn past the fence," Emma said. "Too sick to care for them. Bruno was just helping." Linda didn't speak. Her eyes welled and her jaw trembled, but she didn't cry, not yet. She looked across the road toward Margaret's home, then back at Emma. "I fed Daisy for 3 years. She never let me touch her, but she always came back. Until 2 weeks ago." Her voice cracked. "I thought..." Emma nodded. We all did. Margaret opened the front door moments later to see Linda crossing the road, box in hand. Her eyes were red, her steps uncertain. But when she reached the porch, she looked directly at Bruno, now lying with his paw over the orange kitten, and said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Margaret offered no judgment. "We all do sometimes." The story spread faster than any rumor ever could. This time, not in whispers but in heartfelt retellings. Bruno, the rescuer, the barn, the starving mother, Daisy. Even Cheryl Mathis, who had once spoken the loudest against it all, stopped by with a tin of sardines for the kittens and muttered, "Guess I misjudged." That evening, as the fireplace crackled and the kittens slept curled in a warm pile, Noah sat with his sketchbook open on the table. This was not a drawing of a scene. It was something else entirely. In charcoal and soft gold tones, he had drawn Bruno standing in a glade, shafts of light breaking through trees above him. Around his paws curled the kittens, and in the shadow of the trees a faint silhouette of the mother cat watched with weary, grateful eyes. At the bottom of the page he wrote in block letters, "Guardian of the Forgotten." Emma peeked over his shoulder, then looked up. "You should show that one." Noah didn't answer. But he didn't close the sketchbook either. The sky above Willow Creek had cleared in the way only late autumn skies could, sharp, clean, and full of light that seemed to come from within the trees themselves. The leaves had mostly fallen, revealing branches like fingers stretching toward heaven, and the morning air smelled of firewood, damp soil, and something new, hope. The town, once murmuring in suspicion, now hummed with anticipation. Posters had been taped to shop windows, hand-lettered signs placed along sidewalks. Bruno, Appreciation Day this Saturday at the library lawn. It had started as a simple idea from Miss Calloway, the town librarian. A tall woman in her mid-60s with thick gray curls, always half-tamed beneath a velvet headband, and eyes that sparkled behind red-rimmed glasses, she had spent her life quietly championing animals and poetry alike. Upon hearing Bruno's story and seeing the sketch Noah had given to Emma now pinned proudly behind the library counter, she decided Willow Creek needed to do something rare. Celebrate kindness. Margaret wasn't sure about the idea at first. She wasn't one for public things. But when Miss Calloway came to the house with a thermos of chamomile tea and a calm, persistent tone, she'd relented. "It's not about you," the librarian had said gently. "It's about him, and the ones who can't speak for themselves." Bruno didn't care for fuss. He preferred quiet places, shadows, and the sound of leaves crunching beneath paws. But when the day arrived and the town gathered on the library lawn with blankets, chairs, and hot cider, he stood calmly beside Margaret, tail softly wagging a gentle presence among clapping hands and children's cheers. Daisy, the once starving mother cat, had recovered more quickly than expected under the care of Dr. Elsie Benton, the town's veterinarian. Dr. Benton, a no-nonsense woman with close-cropped white hair, sturdy boots, and a reputation for fixing what others gave up on, had taken Daisy in without question. Now, seated near the front row in the lawn ceremony, she held Daisy in her lap, the cat purring softly, her eyes tracking the crowd. The kittens, now growing healthy and adventurous, were being raised jointly by Margaret, with help from Emma Noah, and even Linda Pearson, who had begun stopping by with fresh fish and hand-sewn blankets. They stayed near Bruno at the event, clustered around his paws like ducklings. No matter how many treats or petting hands appeared, Bruno kept one eye on them at all times. Mayor Cooper gave the opening speech. A rotund man in his 50s with a salt-and-pepper beard and a tie that was always slightly crooked, he was not known for eloquence. But that day his voice trembled slightly as he spoke of a dog who reminded us what it means to protect, to persevere, and to love beyond the rules of nature. When he presented Bruno with a handmade collar woven with gold thread and inscribed with the words, "Protector of the Lost," the dog blinked solemnly and allowed Margaret to fasten it around his neck. The crowd erupted into applause. Several children clapped so hard they dropped their cider. Off to the side, Noah stood quietly with Emma under the library's big oak tree. He held a small stack of postcards, his fingers curled protectively around them. Each one bore the image he had drawn Bruno in a forest glade, bathed in light kittens at his feet, with the title Bruno's Way. It had been Miss Calloway's idea to print them as part of a fundraising campaign for the local animal rescue group. The first print run sold out in 2 days. The second was being handed out at the event with every donation, no matter how small, supporting abandoned or injured animals in the county. Emma grinned at him. "You know they're going to run out again." Noah didn't say anything, but he pulled one card from the stack and handed it to her, the one he'd kept at the very bottom. It had been signed in his shy handwriting, "To Emma. You helped me see the story." Back at school on Monday, Noah surprised everyone, including himself. During homeroom, Miss Avery, their young, sharp-minded teacher with a love for project-based learning and chunky cardigans, had asked the class to share something that inspired them. Normally, Noah would have kept his head down, hoping the moment passed. But something had shifted. His hand rose. It wasn't shaking. He stood beside his desk, reached into his bag, and pulled out one of the postcards. The class went still. A few students leaned in. "This is Bruno Noah," began, voice quiet but clear. "He's our dog. He saved some kittens. People thought he was just wandering around, but he was doing something brave. He was helping." There was a pause. Then Miss Avery said, "Thank you, Noah." He nodded, sat down, and looked out the window. The leaves outside were falling again, but this time the light touched everything. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or light from the heavens. Sometimes they come quietly in the shape of a golden dog lying beside a forgotten kitten. Bruno didn't speak. He didn't ask for attention or recognition. Yet, through his gentle acts, he reminded an entire town that compassion doesn't require words, only courage and love. Perhaps it was more than instinct. Perhaps it was grace. Perhaps God sent Bruno as a guardian, not just for the helpless kittens, but for a lonely boy, a grieving woman, and a community that had forgotten how to believe in small wonders. When we slow down, open our eyes, and open our hearts, we may find that heaven reaches earth in the quietest ways. In your daily life, remember, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply show up for someone who needs you, just like Bruno did. Protect the small, speak for the silent, love without asking why. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a little light today. Comment your thoughts below, and if you believe that Bruno was an angel in disguise, write Amen in the comments. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that honor the bond between animals and people. And may God bless you and your loved ones with peace, kindness, and the courage to care.